Good evening. Good evening, everyone. The hour has struck. Mr. Perez is on his way. He's stuck in traffic, but he texted us. I'm Father Cassiati, the pastor here. I don't have a big speech. It's just that this church, since 1856, has been involved in education. Loyola Blakefield, Loyola University, the St. Ignatius Academy, Cristo Rey High School, and now a preschool, 2-year-olds to 4-year-olds. We've added a kindergarten, and we're working on a K through 4 school across here, all for students that live in Baltimore City from low-income families. That's our commitment to be embedded in Baltimore and help Baltimore. So just great to have you here and to see the church opened up. We have this beautiful building. We want to use it to serve the community. So thank you. Canberra is next.
Thank you, Father Casciati. Good evening to everyone here with us tonight and to viewers across the nation joining us virtually via live streaming. My name is Condra Healy. Welcome to this 2-hour event, Meet Your Candidates for Maryland Governor, hosted by the Justice and Peace Committee of St. Ignatius Catholic Community in Baltimore City. We believe that discussions like this one with candidates for the upcoming election to determine Maryland's next governor are vital so that constituents like us can have as many possibilities as possible to know where our candidates stand on issues of importance to us and to our communities. We hope this forum will help you make informed decisions when you enter the voting booth next November. We want to extend special thanks to the staff and volunteers who have worked for months to make this event possible. St. Ignatius Catholic Community does not support or oppose any particular party or any candidate. Per Baltimore City COVID-19 protocols, face masks are required inside buildings regardless of vaccination status. Here is a bit of information as well as some ground rules for tonight's event. On our altar tonight are 3 of the 4 candidates for governor. 1 is on the way. In alphabetical order, they are Mr. Doug Gansler, Mr. Wes Moore, Mr. Tom Perez is en route, and Mr. Mike Rosenbaum. To be invited, candidates needed to poll at 1% or greater. All the questions we're asking tonight were solicited from St. Ignatius Ministry volunteers prior to the event. These questions have not been provided in advance to candidates, though general themes of social justice were framed in the invitation. We are bypassing opening statements, instead asking for a short 60-second introduction from each candidate telling us why each is running. As candidates respond, we ask that the audience refrain from applauding or, in other words, demonstrating support or non-support for a candidate. We have muted audience participating virtually. We are asking the same question to all 4 candidates, and each will have the same time, 2 minutes to answer. There's no opportunity for rebuttals. Time limits on responses will be strictly observed. A timekeeper will hold cards visible to the speaker, indicating when 15 seconds remain. When the stop card is shown, the speaker must end within 10 seconds. Our moderators are prepared to interrupt the proceedings to enforce the ground rules and format agreed upon by all candidates. Candidates can ask the moderator to restate the question. The candidates will not interrupt one another. Candidates should refrain from personal attacks or charges, and as hard as it may be for many politicians to adhere to this rule, the answer should remain focused on the question asked. Candidates are invited to remain after the forum to meet with attendees outside of this hall. And now, I will introduce you to our moderators for the forum. They are Ms. Kate Walsh and Ms. Glendora Hughes. Ms. Walsh is a tireless education advocate. She is a member of the Pastoral Council at St. Ignatius, and in her working life is president of the National Council for Teacher Equality, which promotes the effective training, hiring, and retention of a strong teacher corps in our public schools. Ms. Glendora Hughes is the General Counsel for the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. She is an active member of the Maryland State Bar Association, past chair of its Labor and Employment Law Section Council, and a member of its Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. She is very active in the community, including current president of National Association of Mental Illness, NAMI Metro. Thank you, and let's get started.
So good evening, gentlemen. We're going to jump right into it. So we're going to start off with one of our first questions. The state of Maryland shares the Chesapeake Bay watershed with 5 other states. Okay. Okay. Sorry. She threw me off. Okay. So.
I do love the Chesapeake Bay, though.
Yeah, you do? That's a good answer. So each one of you have 60 seconds to give your statement about why you are running for governor.
Thank you, and thank you to St. Ignatius for hosting this. And it's always great to be in the city of Baltimore. And the city of Baltimore is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why I'm running for governor. I recall sitting outside of Terra Cafe one day and watching people wander around looking hopeless and aimless and thinking, I may not be able to fix what's going on in Baltimore right now, but this is a beautiful city with beautiful promise, and I want to be part of the solution. So I served for 8 years as your Attorney General. I served for 8 years as State's Attorney of Montgomery County. Before that, I was a federal prosecutor under Eric Holder. I grew up in Maryland. I went to Chevy Chase Elementary, and I still live in Chevy Chase. Went to Yale University and University of Virginia Law School, then came back, and I believe in public service. I spent 23 years in public service, and during COVID, like all of us, I had a lot of time to reflect about what I wanted to do and what my future would be, and my currency is helping people. That's what motivates me. That's what I love to do, so that's why I'm running for governor.
Thank you. Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Good evening, and it's great to be back in this beautiful and historic church, in the city where my wife and I are raising our kids, in the city where I came of age. This is also the city where my mom, who's here today, found her first job as a single mom with benefits, just actually down the street at the Annie Casey Foundation. It's an amazing city, but it's also a city that has some of the highest levels of inequity in our entire state, where we think about where we are, and these are systemic barriers, and our ability to move past them will determine the future of both our city and also our state. And in this moment, the reason why I'm running is that this moment requires battle-tested, future-facing leadership. Leadership that ensures that our communities feel safe, leadership that ensures that our children are being educated for the future, leadership that ensures work, wages, and wealth. And I've been here, working on these issues in partnership with many of you in this room. I built a small business here in Baltimore that helps first-generation students make it to and through college. I have brought millions of dollars to West Baltimore through the national anti-poverty nonprofit that I work on. This is my home, and I'm running to be your governor because we have a powerful and a rare opportunity to address these generational challenges, and I'd appreciate your help in that.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenbaum.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for doing this evening. I'm so particularly pleased to be here because I bought my first house from this church on Eager Street from Father Waters. And, and I have worked with Cristo Rey for years through my company Catalyte. So my name is Mike Rosenbaum, and I'm a lifelong Marylander, and I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm running for governor because I know we need to think differently if we want to solve the inequities that plague our society. The systems that run our state and our country are not working to solve our most significant underlying challenges. Over 20 years ago, I moved here to Baltimore to start a company called Catalyte based on the idea that talent is everywhere and opportunity isn't. And over the last 20 years, we've hired thousands of people here in Baltimore City and across the state and across this country who've moved from an average income in their last job of $25,000 a year to an average income of $98,000 a year 5 years later. Because like you, I know that folks in underrepresented communities have just as much talent as everywhere else, but are too frequently locked out of economic opportunity because of systemic bias based on race and class and gender. Our next governors need to be able to think differently, to act boldly, and to be aggressive if what we want to do is solve our problems rather than just keep talking about them. Thank you so much again. I look forward to this evening's conversation.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We're going to go back to the first question. So the state of Maryland shares Chesapeake Bay watershed with 5 other states in the District of Columbia, or districts. While general pollution and storm runoff contribute to the bay's poor health, the biggest political problem is agricultural runoff. In your view, what is it going to take for Maryland to seriously address the problem of so much agricultural runoff? Mr. Gansler.
Thank you for the question. The environment was, when I was Attorney General of Maryland in particular, that was my single biggest issue here. We did 22 river audits. We took on big corporate polluters. We had the biggest air pollution settlement in American history. We had the biggest water pollution settlement in Maryland history, and asbestos settlements and the like. I took on power plants in West Virginia. I took on fracking, a company called Chesapeake Energy that blew up a fracking well in Pennsylvania that was seeped into Maryland's waters. I was not friends with the poultry industry because they thought that I wanted to go after them, but in fact it's quite different. One of the projects that I wanted to do when I was Attorney General that I will be able to do as governor is to convert the 2 billion pounds of chicken manure that goes into the bay each year into a power source on the Eastern Shore. The technology is available, it's been available, and it actually provides opportunity for more agriculture, more open space, less sprawl, and is the single biggest contributor to the Chesapeake Bay, the pollution of the bay. The bay starts, the Shenandoah starts in, the Susquehanna starts in Cooperstown, New York, and comes down. It's relatively pristine through New York and becomes quite polluted as it goes through Pennsylvania into Lancaster in particular. And one of the things we did was I worked with attorneys general from the Bayshed states and in having them reduce pollution. Well, we're going to need to do that when I'm governor as well. I would commend you to our website. We have a plan, it's a 32-point plan called Green Maryland. It includes solar energy on public spaces throughout the state and in private incentives. It includes wind power off of Ocean City. It includes a moratorium on development in the watershed. And it really is a comprehensive view on what we need to do, including creating the infrastructure for electric vehicles that are going to be coming here sooner than later is something that's literally been driven by the private sector, and we need to be ready for that here in Maryland.
Thank you. Mr. Moore.
Thank you. And I'm really glad to start with this question because we're talking about something that is fundamentally an existential threat. It's an existential threat to our communities, to this city, and also to the state. And we have to be able to have a comprehensive, holistic approach in the way we're dealing with it because of the way we're seeing it and its impacts in our communities is so comprehensive and it's so holistic. We see it when we're talking about environmental injustice and how it shows itself. It is showing itself in not only how we're even talking about things like lead and what that looks like, but we have a neurotoxin that still is in our pipes that our students are drinking from, but we're also seeing the fact that 2 weeks ago, we had almost half of Maryland students who could not go to school because of a storm. Because we had flood levels rising to the point that we haven't seen since Hurricane Isabel. The fact that we have 1,000-year storms now seemingly every 5 years that is now taking an extreme toll on Ellicott City. So when we're talking about things like wastewater runoff, and we're talking about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it is about how we're prioritizing it, the fact that we can accelerate even the targets that we've laid out thus far. The fact that we're talking about 60% by 2030 in greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we can do better than that. That we're talking about making it that the state will have ZEVs, the zero efficiency vehicles, that will have a full fleet by 2030, we can do better than that. And how it's both about how we're talking about the production, our production and our enforcement and our investment in green jobs and solar jobs. It's one of the reasons that we're working to get every young person involved in a service year opportunity in the city of Baltimore. Every single high school student that finishes up, and they'll have an opportunity to work in things like green jobs, invest in technologies, and also invest in entrepreneurs that are doing this work. And at the same time, also invest in mass transit. So when we're talking about things like the Red Line and the decision around the Red Line, that just wasn't a knock to our transportation assets. It was not just a knock to our jobs assets. That was a knock to our environment. And we can do better.
Thank you. Do you care to respond to the question about agricultural runoff?
Yes, no, I think how we're talking about agricultural runoff is actually a direct part of that. That there needs to be an ability to go after the businesses that are most responsible for the agricultural runoff, right? But in addition to that, we also need to have a holistic approach that it includes agricultural runoff, but also the other drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. That there needs to be a comprehensive and holistic approach to it.
Great, thank you. Mr. Rosenbaum.
So I think all of us as Democratic candidates will focus on the health of the Bay, focus on the environment, but I think there are three major opportunities here when we think about agricultural runoff and the health of the Bay. One is, what does the economy of our state look like? And Maryland has had a lower rate of job growth than essentially all of our neighboring states. And the question is why? And the bigger question is, what are the jobs we're creating? We have an opportunity actually to help evolve our economy so we are less reliant on industries that create pollution. And those industries will still exist. There will be a transition of our economy, but we have an opportunity to transition our economy towards cleaner jobs. That's obviously what I've been doing for decades, which is creating thousands of jobs in the state that are cleaner jobs that don't create runoff in the Bay. The other piece, of course, when we think about runoff in the Bay is our relationship with Pennsylvania. Because so much of the Bay and the runoff to the Bay actually occurs in Pennsylvania and comes here. And so the question is, what do we do about that? And that relates to money, which relates to our budget. And when we talk about evolving the economy of the state, we also talk about how do we create space in our state's budget to be able to spend money on the things we need to spend money on, which include creating the incentives so that Pennsylvania and our industries in the state that are focused on agriculture actually can make those transitions, and we can focus on the Bay. But the bigger opportunity actually in Maryland is to be the global center of where climate change innovation occurs. Because Maryland actually is perfectly positioned because of the Bay, because of Fort Meade, because of NOAA, because of NIH, because of our university systems, to actually be the place where the companies start and grow, where we solve climate change, where we solve that set of problems, not just here in Maryland, and not just in this country, but actually globally. What it takes is it takes an investment. Places like Massachusetts have done that, places like Pittsburgh have done that, places like Denver have done that for specific industries. This set of industries that we should be focused on is impact innovation with a particular focus on climate change, which actually will help address the set of issues and create the clean jobs that make all this possible.
Thank you. That leads into the next question, which is about climate change. So all over the world, we are seeing the effects of climate change. Are you willing to put your office behind legislation to address climate change, and what is it specifically that you propose, and how are you expecting to pay for it? Mr. Gansler.
I think they're supposed to, I'm happy to go first.
Okay, Mr. Moore.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it goes back to the frame from the first question. We're talking about something that's an existential challenge. And the truth is that the state of Maryland has a unique responsibility. The state of Maryland, because of our geography, because of our topography, has a unique responsibility to lead on this, not just because it's important because of our geographic basis, but also because it's incredibly important to our long-term prospects, to our economic prospects, and to our health prospects. And so how are we going to think holistically about the economy? About being able to accelerate the goals that have already been laid out, about being able to address the fact that there were 4 major bills that were proposed and vetoed in the last legislative session by the governor, which would have had significant controls on greenhouse gas emissions. That these are things that are crucial when it comes to how the new administration needs to think about this work. And when we think about this work, it is going to be, how are we going to prioritize mass transit? When we had a bill that was taking place down for 270, and a vote that took place for 270, where we had the governor and the comptroller who voted for it, and the state treasurer who voted against it, the state treasurer was absolutely right. And it wasn't just about the expansion of roads. It was about the fact that Nancy Kopp was simply asking for an environmental impact study. Simply asking for a study that said, what is going to be the environmental impact on us making this type of decision? When we are talking about things like the whack-a-mole approach that we have to road expansion, the whack-a-mole approach that we have to mass transit, the whack-a-mole approach that we have to transit as a whole, this is where my administration will lead on this. Because this is going to be the most significant driver of our ability to reduce greenhouse gases. In addition to that, when we're talking about how are we going to fund it, the fact is that we already have allocations within the budget, but in addition to that, we have a generational, once-in-a-generation opportunity where we have new revenue that's coming into the state, dealing with everything from cannabis to sports betting to record income tax revenue to ARPA. If you look at what's happening with ARPA, there's $3.7 billion coming in discretionary, $1.7 billion coming in towards education, and an additional $4+ dealing with infrastructure. That has got to be targeted and focused in making sure that our infrastructure is one that is stable and sound and protects the environment at the same time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rosenbaum.
So Maryland is one of the richest states in the richest country in the world. We actually have the ability to guarantee a career to everyone in Maryland who wants one. And I know that's not exactly the question, and I can talk more about that later, but when we guarantee a career for everyone who wants one, we expand the tax base. When we expand the tax base, we actually create the structural space in our budget to make the investments we need to make. So I've rolled out a plan that guarantees a career for 250,000 people in the first 4 years that frees up $3 billion a year in the state budget. We've had some very good fortune at the moment, which gives us a pocket of cash, but the question is structurally, how are we going to do it going forward? And the real question is, how are we going to make the investments that enable us to lead on sustainability, to lead on issues of climate change, but also to be the global center of where climate change innovation occurs and grows. At the same time, the issue of transportation is a key question in how we think about climate change. And in Maryland, my mother was involved in Montgomery County politics in the late 70s and early 80s. And when she was involved in the late 70s and early 80s, the major topic in Montgomery County at least was traffic and expanding roads. Today, the major topic in Montgomery County and Prince George's County is traffic and expanding roads. And we have been having the same conversation for half a century. What I would suggest is that we move the jobs closer. We move the jobs closer, we won't have to commute as far. And obviously all of us as Democratic candidates will talk about fully investing in public transportation and to have the positive environmental impact from that. But the bigger question is, how do we put less strain on the system and less environmental impact from transportation? And we move the jobs closer. So we have an opportunity to create space, to move jobs closer, to be the global center of where climate change innovation occurs, and have a better quality of life. That's how we will deal with it.
Thank you. I see Mr. Perez is here with us. Okay.
What's your climate change plan? In 2 minutes.
Well, we're going to give you 60 seconds to let us know why you want to run for governor, and then we'll roll into that second question that they're answering now.
Excellent. Good evening. I'm Tom Perez. It's an honor to be here. I am a graduate of Canisius High School in Buffalo, New York. My wife, I met her when she was doing Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and the beauty of Jesuit Volunteer Corps is you get to go to heaven and you get to give somebody a pass. And so I am her pass, and I'm really, really excited about that. My parents taught us that if you want to get to heaven, you better have letters of reference from people living in the shadows. And my whole life has been about making sure that we ensure jobs and justice for everyone. That's what my career has been about, fighting for civil rights, fighting for economic justice. You can't have one without the other. I've done it at a local level, I've done it at a state level, I've done it at a federal level. And I'm running for governor to make sure everybody in this state has access to opportunity. That's what it's all about. The richest state in the country can't possibly have the disparities that exist in this city and in this state. And that is wrong. And that is why I am running, so that we can have access to opportunity, because zip code should never, ever determine destiny. Thanks for having me. And I'm sorry it took me 2 hours to get here.
Thank you again, Mr. Perez. The question that we are responding to are, number two, all over the world, we are seeing the effects of climate change. Are you willing to put your office behind legislation to address climate change? And what is it specifically that you propose, and how are you expecting to pay for it?
Yes. Well, again, we all know the existential dilemmas that we're confronting. And what I would do day one as your governor is appoint a climate and resiliency director. You need both climate and resiliency, because you saw that storm from 3 weeks ago. If you live in Howard County, you saw 200-year floods in 3 years down Ellicott City. So we need to do that, and why we need to do that is because to address climate change comprehensively, we need to implode stovepipes within state agencies, because everyone has skin in the game. One of your, I think your first question was about ag runoff. And we need sustainable agricultural practices, because over 50% of the runoff in the Chesapeake Bay is coming from unsustainable farming. We don't have to tell farmers that they can't farm anymore, but we farm differently and better. We can become a vegetable basket for the Mid-Atlantic. On the climate change front, making sure that we are producing clean energy. We have a tremendous opportunity to be the offshore wind capital of the East Coast. Larry Hogan dropped the ball on this. We should have been leading 10 years ago. And so when we do that, we are creating good union jobs, and we need to make sure we're investing in career and technical education here so that these jobs are accessible to everyone. We need to make sure that we're investing in transit options so that we not only are building the Red Line here, but we're using more electric buses. We're making sure that these jobs that are going to be in place at Sparrows Point are accessible to people in Southwest Baltimore who are transit dependent. And so when we do all of this, when we have our climate and resiliency czar who is going to be coordinating these activities, I think there's so much we can do. And when I think about climate change, I think about jobs. I think about opportunities. And I think about making sure that those opportunities are accessible to everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Gansler.
Thank you. The reason why being experienced matters is because one that is experienced understands how to pull the levers of justice and how to do the levers of government and actually get things done. So the question was about legislation, and each year when I was Attorney General, for example, I sponsored and promoted a legislative bill around the environment, most of which were directed at climate change. One of them was actually getting arsenic out of chicken feed, which we were able to do so it didn't get into the bay from the first question. But I think if you look at, and obviously my entire professional career has been focused, other than when I was a homicide prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, has been focused around the environmental issue, because it's so important. We started the first environmental crimes unit in the state's history when I was the state's attorney in Montgomery County and went after polluters there. But I think the answer, the legislative piece is very important going forward, and working with the legislature and having relationships with folks in the legislature is going to be critical. But I think we really, when you're looking at this, the big issue is mass transit and getting more cars off the road, and getting the conversion to electric vehicles, getting to be 100% carbon neutral. But one of the first things we have to do is get the Red Line back in business right here in Baltimore. And the mass transit, the transit situation is incredible here in Baltimore. There is none. There's some light rail, but we need to really be innovative and imaginative on how we do things. Getting the Purple Line back and going in Montgomery County, Prince George's County. Getting light rail from Branch Avenue to Waldorf, so folks from Southern Maryland have mass transit as well. Getting a mass transit system from Shady Grove to Frederick is going to be important. Once the Hogan expansion of 270 happens, we need to get people from Frederick down to Shady Grove, where all you're doing is moving the bottleneck higher up. So there's a lot of things we need to do in the mass transit world, and we need to get started right away. And obviously, 4 more years of Republican leadership, that's not going to happen.
Thank you.
So, gentlemen, our next 2 questions have to do largely with poverty. Specifically, let's talk about homelessness. St. Ignatius has been involved in feeding the homeless, meals for nearly every week for over 30 years. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness estimate that there are almost 6,400 citizens of Maryland who are homeless. What would you do as governor to lower the number of people in the state who are either forced to live on the street, the woods, or their cars, or who choose to do so because of mental illness. And I believe we start with Mr. Perez for this one.
Well, this is an issue near and dear to my heart because my wife has worked for the last 25 years at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. And I chaired the Interagency Council on Homelessness when I was Labor Secretary.
It was a gimme question.
Housing First is a really good strategy that has worked in a number of places. So step number one, get people housed. And in order to do that, we need to make sure we're expanding the capacity, the supply of housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. Step number two is understanding comorbidities. Many people experiencing homelessness have mental health issues, they have physical issues, and we need to understand those comorbidities. We need to build a community mental health infrastructure and a community behavioral health infrastructure. When we do that, we will solve a lot of challenges, including some of the challenges involving people experiencing homelessness. And what we have now is insufficient. We deinstitutionalized decades ago, but we didn't build that infrastructure, the community mental health infrastructure and the community behavioral health infrastructure. And that's what we have to do now as a community. We have to work with the police department on this too, because the police department, too many cases involve people who are in mental health crisis, who don't belong in jail, they don't belong in the emergency room, they belong in treatment. So all of these interconnected things are what we have to do. We actually were able to functionally eliminate veterans' homelessness in 3 or 4 cities across America, including Salt Lake City, Houston, and Phoenix. How did we do that? We did it by having unprecedented levels of interagency collaboration. We need to break down stovepipes. And that's one thing I've done a lot of, because these challenges aren't just about the Department of Housing and Community Development or the DHR or one segment or another. They are everyone. And when we implode those stovepipes and build those partnerships, that's how we solve the challenge.
Okay. Mr. Rosenbaum, don't tell us that your wife works for the homeless
My
shelters.
wife does not.
His wife's homeless.
However, I think we all recognize that obviously as one of the richest states in the richest country in the world, the fact that there is anyone homeless in this state is a crime. I was growing up in Montgomery County when the Reagan administration defunded St. Elizabeth's and led to a massive increase in homelessness in the greater DC area. And, and the question of mental health capacity obviously is a key one when we think about mental health. It's only one of the pieces, but it is a key one. And we will all talk about how we need to fully fund and restructure mental health capacity so everyone has access to it, but there's another set of questions, which is that we don't have enough mental health professionals to do all the work that we need to do when we talk about the increase in mental health capacity. So how are we going to create those pathways to have more mental health professionals, which is actually the plan that I've rolled out. In order to enable a pathway for everyone in this state to have a pathway to a career, and in particular, folks to have pathways into mental health and other healthcare careers. So I think that's step one. Step two is that not everyone who is homeless because of mental health issues. And frequently it is the fact that the average income it takes to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in this state is $28.60 an hour. And as Democrats, we talk a lot about the minimum wage, and the minimum wage is obviously critically important. But if it costs $28.60 an hour to rent a 2-bedroom apartment, then being at the minimum wage, even if it's $15 or $20 an hour, we're still poor, we're still insecure. So the question is, how do we all have that pathway? And there's a combination of things that we need to do. One is we can guarantee that pathway to everyone. We can guarantee a career to everyone in Maryland. We have the money in the budget to do it. We just need to be willing to spend it. And the other is that we need to enable folks to have access to housing. And there are lots of reasons why folks don't have access to housing even as folks move up in income. So at Catalyte, as folks move from $25,000 a year in their last job to $98,000 a year 5 years later, far too many folks still were housing insecure, even making almost $100,000 a year. And the question is why? And the reason is credit. Because credit creates limitations for folks to be able to access housing. Lots of different kinds of housing, rental housing, and ownership housing. And part of the other piece that the state needs to do is guarantee mortgages and guarantee rentals so that we do credit enhancements so folks have greater access to housing.
Good. Mr. Gansler?
Speaking of politics, I wrote my college thesis on the right for the homeless to vote. And I don't know whatever happened with that, actually. But I do think in the richest state, in the richest country in the world, the fact that we have so many people homeless is just outrageous. And rich people don't need a governor, poor people do. Homeless people certainly do. And we have to address sort of the reasons why folks in the long term are homeless. Obviously, in the short term, we need to get them housing, we need to get them off the streets, we need to provide mental health services for everybody that is homeless. In the long term, one of the things I did when I was state's attorney was start at the Family Justice Center in Montgomery County. And when I'm governor, every region in the state is going to have that, which is wraparound services for families and getting them services, providing them services. Particularly, there's a lot of homeless folks that use that service. But we need to figure out why are people homeless. And I think some of the answers have been addressed, which is veterans, returning citizens, folks coming out of jail, which is a focus that we ought to be very concerned with, making sure people have the ability to succeed and not be recidivists, and mental health. And those are three of the biggest causes, but also the ability to have a place to live, and affordable housing sort of comes into this equation. We need to make sure we have adequate affordable housing and places for people to live, because people don't want to be homeless, other than people with mental health issues that we do have to address. So we need to have universal child care. We need to have universal pre-K, so because there's no better way to get a job and keep a job than be educated. And we need to obviously pass, I'm sure we'll get to it, the blueprint for our education going forward. So there's a lot of causes to it, but the immediate thing that we need to do as governor and in our state and with the Democratic governor is to have empathy for those folks who are homeless and get them a place to live.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Moore, to you.
Thank you. This is an issue that I have worked most of my entire adult life on, because whether it was running one of the largest anti-poverty nonprofits in this country, there is no greater driver of poverty in our country than homelessness, than eviction, than people who immediately find themselves out of a home. Whether it was even before then, when I had a chance to support first in college, first in family students going to college. Do you know one of the #1 drivers for students who were not able to finish school? Housing insecurity. This has become a persistent ill that is impacting every segment of our society. And when we think about the things that we have to be able to do to address that right now, one is we have to understand which tools we have at our disposal right now, which we are not using. For example, I was proud to be the first candidate to come out and call for an extension of the emergency eviction moratorium. Because at a time right now, as we're heading back into school, where the reason for the lifting of the eviction moratorium was that, well, we were well past where we needed to be on COVID-19 and on the pandemic, the reality is no, we are not. And there's no reason for us to not have an eviction moratorium that is not extended for people. We've watched other states do it. Maryland should follow the same. When it comes to inventory that we have for our housing, we need to follow the 3P model. We need to focus on the preservation of current inventory, the production of new inventory, and also the protection of those who are living in their homes. That we have to make sure that we can believe in and enforce the idea that housing should be a human right. And no one should have to worry about that. The third piece is how we're going to focus on work, wages, and wealth. Because one of the biggest drivers that we have for eviction is when you have people who are spending 50 and 60% of their monthly income on housing. We need to work on an affordable revenue and an affordable platform that we can actually keep people in their homes, because we are putting them on long-term proper pathways to economic stability.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. So, depending on how you look at it, Maryland is one of the country's wealthiest states, if not the wealthiest state. And still about 1 in 10 Marylanders live in poverty. While we recognize that you may have a long list of strategies, and we've heard about some of them, for addressing this problem, what single approach would be your highest priority? And I believe this time we are back to Mr. Rosenbaum.
So we're going to guarantee a career for everyone in Maryland who wants one. It'll be a several billion-dollar investment, but we will hire folks to learn. If I make $12 to $15 an hour, I'm barely able to make ends meet, if I'm able to make ends meet. I certainly don't have space to pay a tuition, and I certainly don't have space to eat and breathe while going to school, or while being an apprentice, or while developing a new skill. Most folks in Maryland and most folks in this country would choose to move industries if they could. But we have too many barriers for that to happen. When we allow folks to move industries and move up, what happens is we have more people who work, we have more people who pay taxes, we have fewer economic supports required by the state, we free up cash. So we have the few $1 billion to spend. It's the best and way we could spend money ever. We will hire folks while folks learn. We'll provide health insurance, we'll fully fund tuitions and costs of apprenticeship and skills development, we'll pay for childcare, we'll pay for transportation, and we'll provide $2,000 forgivable loans so folks can fill up their tank with gas, fix up their car if they need to use that, be able to buy clothes, and be able to bridge to the first few paychecks. That will lower the barriers for everyone to be able to unlock their talents. And when that happens, we will have economic growth, and we'll be able to use that economic growth to finance investments so that everyone in this state has that pathway. And we can transform our state that way, and we can become a model for the rest of the country.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Gansler.
Yeah, I think the best way out of poverty and the best way to advance yourself economically is to have an education. I was just looking down this list of people here. We have Yale, Hopkins, Brown, Harvard. And that's because we all thought of how important it was to get an education. Our parents made us get an education, and we all got education we were able to use to leverage into a place where we thought we should run for governor. And so we have a blueprint. This isn't something that the next governor has to design. The Kerwin Commission actually came through and said, what can we do and what should we do in Maryland to make sure that every child has an education and therefore has the ability to get a job and to earn a good living, whether they want to choose to give up making a lot of money and go into public service or what have you. And that includes universal pre-K, which is something I've been talking about now for 10 years, and the need to have that. That includes paying our teachers more. That includes getting violence out of schools so people can actually learn. I remember I went to speak at Patterson Park at high school there one time when I was Attorney General, and it was unbelievable what I was seeing out in my vision. And I said to the person who was walking me from the front door to the auditorium, I said, let me ask you a question. If somebody really just wanted to get an education here, they had blinders on, they could do it, would that be possible? And the guy looked at me like I had 4 heads. He said, no. And that's unbelievable. I started an inner-city lacrosse league here called Charm City Youth Lacrosse here in Baltimore 12 years ago. We have hundreds of kids that come every Saturday morning, obviously not during COVID. And we've been able to get some of them into some of the private schools so they can use lacrosse as leverage to go forward. And you see these kids, and they're 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. They're beautiful, smart, wonderful kids from underserved families. And on Monday morning, they're going to a school where if they live long enough to graduate, they probably are not going to be able to read at a 6th or 7th grade level. And they certainly aren't going to one of the schools that we did. So I think that is the most important thing we can do, provide an education.
Thank you. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, yeah. Attorney General Gansler is right. We did all go to those schools. But there was a place I went to before, Johns Hopkins. And I'm proud of the fact that, I'm the only candidate who actually has an associate's degree. I went to a junior college. In fact, people say you're the first Black Rhodes Scholar in the history of Johns Hopkins University, and you wear your ring from your from your junior college. I do, because that's my salvation. And that's part of the answer, is when I think about the reasons that people fall into poverty, there's oftentimes no singular reason, there's no singular effect, and there's no one singular solution. When my dad went to the hospital, unshaven, and his clothes were disheveled, and there was assumptions about whether or not he had insurance. When my mom went to the hospital to go check on him, and they asked her questions like, is he prone to exaggeration? And they released him from the hospital with the instructions to go home and get some rest, and 5 hours later, he died in front of me. There was no singular impact that had on our family. You just watch how that spiral takes place. And so the way we're going to impact poverty within our society and then impact economic mobility is by looking at work and wages and wealth in a holistic way. When we're talking about work, it means we are going to work with our K-12 system to make sure we are operationalizing the blueprint, which I was very proud to work on for the past 2.5 years with our legislators, to implement a universal pre-K system, to make sure that we are investing in our community schools, because it's not just curriculum, why students are truant. It's also about things like dental care and eye care and the high number of students that have asthma. It's about working with our community colleges and our junior colleges and our trade schools to make sure that just because a student chooses not to go to a 4-year path does not mean that they do not have a pathway to economic stability in their life. It's about accelerating how we are going to get to a $15 minimum wage. Right now, we're talking about getting a $15 minimum wage at 2025. That will not happen. In my administration, it will happen faster. And it's about how we can create mechanisms of wealth for our families, because singular shocks are enough to create generational challenges for our families. By making sure we can give people an economic foundation and stability, that's how we address this issue of poverty in the long term.
Thank you.
Yeah. If there was one singular solution to poverty, I would like to think that it would have been implemented many years ago. And unfortunately, there isn't. And we need an all-of-the-above strategy and then some. 25% of our COVID deaths in this state were a product of the fact that people don't have health insurance. 25%. We've had over 10,000 COVID deaths. I have a plan to get us from where we are now, which is 94%, thank God for Obamacare, to 100%, so that everybody has access to quality, affordable health care, including dental care. Talk to DeMonte Driver's family. I remember him vividly, a teenager who died of a toothache because he didn't have access to health care. I prosecuted as a civil rights lawyer at the Justice Department school districts that were chronically separate and unequal. If you lived on one side of the tracks, you had AP, gifted and talented offerings up the wazoo. If you lived on the other side of the tracks, you had nothing. And if you don't have those opportunities, you don't have social mobility in this country. I worked at the Labor Department. I referred to us as Match.com because we matched job seekers who wanted to punch their ticket to the middle class with employers who wanted to grow their business. And the good news here in Maryland is we have tremendous opportunities. But we need to make sure that as we build offshore wind, that those opportunities are accessible in every community. And that is why I am such a big fan of career and technical education. We need college or career readiness. Not everyone needs a college degree to punch their ticket to the middle class. We need to make sure that we have a plan to build affordable housing in this state. And we have a serious supply problem. So when we do all of these, and when we remember that it's so critically important to take people where they are. If you are a person with a criminal history, we need to remove barriers to employment. If you are coming out of prison in 12 months, we shouldn't wait for you to come out of prison. We should do what I did when I was labor secretary. We had one-stop centers behind the fence so that we could help people be ready. When we do all of these, when we understand those barriers, I think that's how we can tackle this and really make sure we succeed.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Ready for the next round?
Yeah, welcome back.
Okay, I'm back. So, our next question for you gentlemen is, with the overt rise of white supremacy and the groups, and the attacks on any attempt to address this country's and state's racial history with sound bites and pointed attacks on teaching curriculums, what is your stance on addressing social justice in the state of Maryland? We will start with, I believe,
I think it's me.
You, Mr. Gansler.
Unfortunately, that's a very, very broad question. So, social justice is something that, in my 23 years in government, I've been working on diligently and vehemently, and started back when I was, when I was a kid, and always been very focused on it and aware of social justice issues that we have. It's interesting, we're here at a political forum, and we're a state that has a checkered, to say the least, history in this capacity. Yet we now have an African American Speaker of the House. We're about to have an African American Treasurer. One of the two main candidates for Comptroller is African American. One of the two main candidates for Attorney General is African American, and we have 3 African Americans running for governor and a Latino and elsewhere. So we do embrace our diversity as a state. I was fortunate to run Barack Obama's campaign with Elijah Cummings here in Maryland, and we won that. So Maryland is doing better than it was. I guess I would focus on one issue, which I hope we'll get to at some point, which is criminal justice, and that's the area that I've been most focused on in this space. Starting back in 1989, when I was head of the NAACP Criminal Justice Committee in Montgomery County, working on issues of diversity, making sure we had diversity on the bench. Later, I made sure we had diversity in the state's attorney's office. Later, I made sure we had diversity in the attorney general's office. And then doing things like putting in the first drug court in Maryland's history to make sure that we kept people out of jail and gave them a pathway to address health problems, addictions, and make them productive citizens, making sure that we had domestic violence dockets. So we were treating people fairly in that context, and we'll have a domestic violence docket in every courthouse in the state going forward. So I already mentioned the Family Justice Center, and we need to address that, because what we saw on January 6th, which is the anniversary is coming up soon, all these people coming out from under a rock and climbing up the Capitol was outrageous in this country. In fact, well, my time has expired, but we'll talk about these issues, I think, going forward as well.
Thank you. Mr. Moore.
Thank you. To be clear, the experience and the history of people of color in this country, it's traumatic and exhausting. To be clear, that we live in a remarkable city, but it's also a city that is the birthplace of creative injustices like redlining and determining where people could live. That this is a remarkable state, but we also live in a state that has an 8-to-1 racial wealth gap. And that's not because one group's works 8 times harder. That there are structural barriers that continue to allow these disparities to exist and continue to make the existence and the experience of people of color in this state so troubling. But the way we have to address it is actually by focusing on policy and structural changes to these structural challenges. It's one of the reasons why I was so proud of the fact that while I was CEO of one of the largest nonprofits in this country, that we led on an initiative called the Power Fund, where we understood the fact that even in philanthropy, over the past 20 years, there's been a 400% increase in philanthropic dollars that were given, yet during the same time, less than 10% of those dollars were given to organizations led by people of color. And so we started this initiative called the Power Fund, which resulted in to about a $20 million fund where we supported organizations, nonprofit organizations, social service organizations that were primarily led by people of color. That we were able to lead on an initiative called the Power Fund, lead on an initiative called 90 to 0, which is addressing the racial wealth gap and being able to partner with organizations such as everyone from Goldman Sachs to Starbucks to Howard to Harvard to say what are the best practices that we can do in our own elements and own areas, and then also adjust on policy, where I was proud to work with Speaker Jones on her Black Agenda, her groundbreaking Black Agenda last year. But it also must be about economics. It must do things like how I was working with Senator Antonio Hayes on fair appraisal value, about how we must address the racial wealth gap that exists within our society, because if we're not talking about economic justice, then everything else will feel performative in the real life of people of color within this state.
Thank you. Mr. Perez.
George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd shocked the nation. I have to say, for me, my reaction was the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because I was prosecuting police misconduct cases back in the 80s. I prosecuted an LAPD officer pre-Rodney King. Civil rights is the unfinished business of America. And we need to understand that the racial justice and the social justice challenges we have, sometimes they're very overt. I used to prosecute neo-Nazis. There was nothing subtle about what they were doing. Those reflect a cancer of the soul, and we must continue to aggressively enforce this and understand that it is a scourge on our nation. You look at the incidents of hate crimes rising against our AAPI brothers and sisters, our Native American brothers and sisters, our trans brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters. But we also must understand that there are other forms of discrimination that, while not as overt, are no less hurtful. I remember the Wells Fargo case when I led the Civil Rights Division. The corrosive power of fine print transformed the American dream into the American nightmare for so many black and brown people, including people here. The lawlessness of Wall Street and so many actors that brought about our foreclosure crisis caused so much poverty in this country. And when I settled the Wells Fargo case, I demanded one more thing from Wells Fargo. We had a national case. I demanded that they settle 3 more cases filed by 3 cities, Memphis, Chicago, and Baltimore. And it was unconscionable what was happening to black homeowners in the city of Baltimore. With the same credit score, the same credit history, they were just as qualified to own their homes, but the color of their skin was what was resulting in their being moved into poverty. So folks, enforcement matters. We need to continue to do that. That's not enough, but it is a critically important part of what we're doing and what we must do.
Thank you very much for that response. Mr. Rosenbaum.
So I spent a year as a student criminal defense lawyer in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And in Roxbury, Massachusetts, I was primarily defending folks who were charged with possession and distribution of small amounts of cannabis. And I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There were plenty of people possessing small amounts of cannabis in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There was no one prosecuted for possession of small amounts of cannabis in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I think we all recognize that there's basic structural issues in the system where racial bias, embeds itself in the criminal justice system and the economic system, and that's why I've spent my life working on the issue that talent is everywhere and opportunity isn't. And the reason I originally started working on that was because my grandfather and his 2 brothers left Germany as Hitler was coming to power in the 30s. Germany in the 30s is an example of what happens when folks don't have pathways to dignity. It becomes kindling for hatred and violence. And obviously that hatred and violence is what's happened in this country and has been here for a long time. But we talk about racial equity, and we will all talk about racial equity. All Democratic politicians will talk about racial equity. Everyone will talk about racial equity. But the reality is this has been around for decades and centuries, and in fact, we've all recognized the structural issues that have been here for decades and centuries, and we've recognized them for decades. So obviously, I moved here to Baltimore originally to start a company that was about reducing bias based on race, class, and gender in hiring and promotion, initially in the tech industry, which is frankly one of the more racist and sexist industries in the world, and then in healthcare. And that actually is obviously what I've spent my life doing, but the question is, why haven't we fixed these problems? I mean, again, we've all been talking about it forever. Why haven't we fixed the problems? And I guess what I would suggest is that I think part of the challenge is the political system itself. The political system itself creates an incentive to run for re-election and get the next job. When that is your incentive, you have an incentive to do little things. Lots of fabulous $10 and $20 million programs all over the place that sound great that you can run for re-election on. You don't have the incentive to spend the billions of dollars to fundamentally change the systems that we've all recognized are the problem. And so what I would suggest is that if our motivation is a long-term political career, it is almost impossible to solve the problem, because when you fight the systems fight back.
Thank you for your response, gentlemen. We're going to switch to another topic, immigration. So we'll start with you, Mr. Moore. 3 jurisdictions in the state of Maryland are a part of a federal-local partnership known as the 287G program, where local police are permitted to carry out some of the duties of immigration and custom enforcement ICE officers. What is your stance on the 287G program? And if it is something you will support, what is your specific plan for training local police to engage in these actions?
Yes, we will not support the actions of that measure of cooperation. We will override the governor's vetoes on these issues. The challenge that we have when it comes to immigration is we still have a system where we have people who are our neighbors, members of our state, who do not feel like they have the same measures of protection from our state. And so when we think about what is it that we have to do in our fundamental philosophy when it comes to being able to support our immigrants, first we have to understand what a crucial role immigrants play within our society. We're talking about 1 in 7 Maryland residents, 23% of our business owners. We're talking about families, frankly, like mine, where my mom immigrated. I'm the grandchild of immigrants. And so the idea that we are then forced then to cooperate and be able to turn over information over on our neighbors is something that is untenable and does not make any sense. And so from our position, from our administration frame, we have to be able to come up with not just an affirmative statement, but also policies that, in working with the legislature, to make sure that our immigrant families do not have to walk in fear, whether they're on their way to school or on their way to their jobs, that ICE officers, if somehow in cooperation, are going to then impede their ability to have measures of movement within our society.
Thank you very much for that answer, Mr. Perez.
Yeah, I've worked on this issue when I was at DOJ, and I agree with Wes's conclusion about the veto override. You know, the most important tool an officer has in her arsenal is the trust of the community. When you don't have the trust of the community, you don't have anything. You can't solve crime, you can't move forward, and these 287G agreements are promoting distrust within the community because you can't rely on an officer if you've been a victim of crime. I was the guy who took on a guy named Joe Arpaio. I don't know if y'all ever heard of Joe Arpaio, Maricopa County, the idiot sheriff? Joe Arpaio is the former sheriff of Maricopa County. And when we were doing that case, we had people in that department who said to us, people who were cooperating, who said, you know, we talk about building walls. He was building walls of distrust. These sorts of agreements build walls of distrust. And so we had victims of human trafficking who wouldn't come forward, victims of sexual assault who wouldn't come forward. We need to solve this problem, comprehensive immigration reform. I was working for Senator Kennedy back in '96 when we last passed comprehensive immigration reform. And back then, when the party of Lincoln controlled in Washington, we could come together because the party of Lincoln was once the party of immigration. Unfortunately, now we have the party of Trump. But in this bill, the infrastructure bill that will be passed in the coming weeks, there are important provisions that are important down payments to help immigrants, to make sure that tens of millions of immigrants who are working can keep that permit, to make sure that we are starting the road on that pathway. Because the ultimate solution of this is to pass comprehensive immigration reform. It's an economic imperative, it's a moral imperative, and it's a healthcare imperative for our country. And when I am governor, we will work closely with Washington and others to get back to this, because we have to pass it.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenbaum.
So, obviously, I fully agree with my colleagues. Fully agree with my colleagues. I think there's another opportunity here, though, which when we think about immigration, I think the question is, how do we make Maryland where folks want to come? And, you know, obviously everything that my colleagues have talked about is about, you know, ensuring that we can maintain trust and protecting the downside of some of recent developments in national politics. But I think there's an opportunity for Maryland specifically in making Maryland a place where it's comfortable for folks who are immigrating to come. And we haven't done that. There are things that we can do that are relatively simple, like making sure that our signs and our documents are in multiple languages, so that when folks come here, we can read. There are things we can do, like 10% of my company's workforce historically has been folks who are recent immigrants. The reason is that frequently when folks have experience in another country and they come here, they can't apply that experience here. Their degree doesn't apply, their experience doesn't apply. We can help fix that issue, and we can make Maryland the place that is most appealing for folks to come. Because as everyone will say, everyone on this stage will say, and I'm sure everyone in this room will say, that immigration is obviously what made this country. Immigration is obviously what unlocks massive amounts of economic value. Immigration, I think every piece of research out there has demonstrated that folks who are immigrants are more likely to create jobs, create companies, and unlock economic growth for all of us. So the question is, why haven't we done it? That's what we need to do as a state. We can make it a more comfortable place for folks who are immigrating by doing everything that my colleagues have talked about, but we can do more so that this is where everyone wants to come.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Mr. Gansler.
Thank you. The great thing about having a record is you have a record. And so I actually dealt with this issue when I was state's attorney in the most diverse county in the state. And we had this problem with ICE trying to come and pick up our prisoners in jail and in the correctional facility. And we did not allow them to do that. And so what we did do is if somebody had a warrant and they had committed a violent offense, then we extradited that person to the state where they had the warrant. So just trying to answer the actual question, we will obviously not be participating with the federal government to facilitate sending people home to what they believe is their home, as opposed to what we believe is their home, which is wherever they came from in Maryland. So the immigration issue broader, which has just been addressed, there's two. I look at this as a binary situation. You either provide a pathway to citizenship or you don't, and let the Republicans keep using it as a wedge issue for all of us going forward. And we need to, on the federal level, do that. And immigration is a federal issue by nature, by definition. It's about other people from other countries coming to our country. We need to fix that. But in the meantime, in this state where we will continue to embrace diversity and see it as our biggest strength as a state, we'll provide a climate, both an economic climate, an educational climate, a public health climate, a jobs climate, to make sure that people from other places feel welcome here and are in fact welcome here in our state of Maryland.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for answering that set of questions. Kate?
Some, including myself, would assert that the Democrats have shot themselves in the foot over such politically fraught terminology as defund the police. As we saw in Virginia, what teachers teach about race and racism is also politically fraught. Assuming you get past the primary, how do you plan on approaching these emotional and volatile issues? So I believe we start with Mr. Perez.
With facts. That's how I would start. The most important tool a police officer has is the trust of our community. I oppose defunding the police. When we took on Joe Arpaio, we didn't defund the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. We reformed it. And part of those reforms included investments in training. Here in Baltimore City, the Freddie Gray, in the aftermath of Freddie Gray, what we're doing here right now is making sure that we are investing in a community mental health infrastructure, investing in training, investing in officer wellness. These are critically important investments because we have public safety challenges here. And when we make those investments, we enable police departments to do their jobs effectively. Now, I'm a strong believer in local control in education. Larry Hogan isn't. Think about it. He issued an executive order directing that every school district start after Labor Day. Why'd he do that? Because his friends in Ocean City wanted to have an extra week of tourism. I think the city of Baltimore and Baltimore County and Montgomery County ought to be able to make their own choices. If they choose to start after Labor Day, that's their prerogative. But he's the person who attacked local control in education. In Virginia, critical race theory is not taught. So Glenn Youngkin is going to issue an executive order on day one to outlaw a practice that doesn't currently exist. Day two, he will be outlawing voting by Martians, I believe, as well, as long as you're on these things that don't exist. We need to understand that these dog whistle issues will continue to exist. And what we need to do in our schools is promote civic engagement, understanding that we are a remarkable nation of immigrants, that when we embrace our differences, that is America at its best. That's what we should be teaching. And when we teach science, when we teach facts, when we respect local control, I think those are things that can help us thrive.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenbaum.
The major issue in this election and in this state and in this country is systemic bias based on race and class and gender is preventing economic opportunity. That is what this election is going to be about. Today in Maryland, we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the country, even though we're one of the richest states in the country. We have a higher unemployment rate than 39 other states, 10th highest unemployment rate in the country. At the same time, we have 100,000 open jobs in 4 industries that provide pathways to a job that pays at least $65,000 a year without a college degree. The trades, manufacturing, healthcare, and technology. That mismatch, the fact that far too many in our state are hurting, far too many in our state are stuck, far too many jobs are going unfilled, it's preventing us from creating jobs, it's preventing us from creating economic growth, and it's preventing us from having the basic lifestyle that we should have in this state, we should have in this city, and we should have in this state. That's what the election's going to be about. I'm not afraid to talk about it. I'll call it out directly. The reason for the issue is because of systemic bias based on race and class and gender. I'm happy to say it. I'll say it in primary. I'll say it in a general.
Thank you, sir.
Unpacking your question, I think there were 3 parts of it. One sort of talked about the elections we just saw in Virginia, and actually I thought New Jersey was the more astounding one. I don't think people in New Jersey thought there was even a Republican running, and he almost won. We are facing what is going to be the most Republican year, next year, 2022, in our lifetimes. And I don't care how old you are here, but it's going to be in our lifetimes. We saw it in Virginia, New Jersey. We saw it the year before when 77 million Americans walked into the voting booth and voted for someone who I think is a mentally ill, narcissistic dictator, wannabe moron, who was our president. And they did it just last year. And if you don't think that's coming to Maryland, you're kidding yourself. I mean, we've lost 3 of the last 5 elections already, and we lost the last 2 in Democratic years. And so we need to make sure that those talking points are not out there. Yes, in schools, we need to teach, and to quote my colleague Tom Perez, we need to teach facts. The fact is, this country is built on the backs of African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, everybody, and we need to teach that. And so that obviously should be part of the curriculum going forward, along with financial literacy and some other areas that ought to be included, including vocational training. In terms of defunding the police, I'm the only one in the race that has been in criminal justice on either side, and did it for 22 years, and I guess 23 if you include my clerkship. And we've been working on making sure the system has been fair. That's an issue that I worked on when I was state's attorney, when I was assisting United States attorney and as attorney general, and we'll continue to do that. So I believe that the main function of government is to keep its people safe. And do we need to be more imaginative and innovative and creative on how we police in this country? Absolutely. But we have to recognize that crime disproportionately affects communities of color and underserved communities. We need someone that has actually been in the criminal justice system to fix the criminal justice inequities that we have today.
I think we have to be honest about the role that racism and classism and sexism has historically played in our society. And it's not just on the fact that we have seen how racial disparities have cost this country $16 trillion. That if we could fix racial disparity within this country, that we would actually add $1.5 trillion over the past decade. It is also about the silent messages that we are sending to our families and to our children. You know, the reality is that I think about it in context of my life and my existence, where, you know, I am a graduate of Johns Hopkins University, and just in the past year, we all learned that the history of Johns Hopkins being a great abolitionist wasn't necessarily complete, that he also owned human beings, enslaved people, that I received a Rhodes Scholarship. But we know the history of Cecil Rhodes is that he was a vehement racist. that I was in the military and I served on bases like Fort Bragg, named after Confederate generals, people who despised me and my ancestors. We have to understand that this is a history that is involved in everything that we do. And at the same time, we also have to understand that that's not what happened in Virginia. What also happened in Virginia was that we had parents who were still struggling around the fact that learning loss for their child is real. That we also had families who were struggling with the fact that they've watched not just jobs, but entire industries go away over the past 16 months. That we have to focus on, yes, being able to identify truth where it shows itself, because identifying that truth does not make us weak as a society. Actually, it makes us strong. It's one of the most powerful things about America and the American journey, is that this progression that we have as a country, while the history of our country has been uneven, it's one that we've evolved in together. And at the same time, we can never lose focus, not in June and not in November, as to what are going to be the issues that people are going to be voting on when they head to the voting box.
Good. Thank you. Ending the evening's questions on an emotional note, we recognize that each of you is on record for supporting abortion rights. But do you support efforts by the Maryland General Assembly to insert the right to an abortion in the state constitution? Also, how about legislation to legalize assisted suicide? And Mr. Rosenbaum.
I do support efforts to insert the right to have reproductive choice in the Maryland Constitution. I don't think that there should be any limitations on that. I think that the fact that, that for the first time in many decades, the pathway for the U.S. Supreme Court to uphold Roe and Casey, I think is questionable. And so I fully support all efforts to ensure that there is no abridgment of reproductive rights in Maryland. I am also supportive of efforts to deal with a slightly more complicated set of questions related to legalized suicide.
Okay. Mr. Gansler?
Well, I support death with dignity. I lost both my parents. My mother was a teacher in public schools. My father was the Undersecretary of Defense of the United States and was a public servant. And I lost both of them within the last 5 years, and it was a very long runway to get there, and I just think that if anyone's gone through it, they're gonna rethink that issue, and so I think that's a personal choice with the person, his or herself, as well as the family. Whether it ought to be in the Constitution, I don't have an opinion. I haven't really thought about it. In terms of women's reproductive rights, again, I've led during crisis, and I think there was a crisis in this state when gay people were not allowed to marry the people that they loved. So I was the first statewide official, and I think the only one for a long time, would go down and testify in Annapolis in favor of marriage equality. I wrote an opinion in 2010 recognizing out-of-state same-sex marriage here at what I was told was a great political risk. Ironically, I was the only statewide elected official in America, non-federal race, that didn't have an opponent in the general or the primary, and got 1.3 million votes, so it actually turned out no one really cared about that issue as much as the Republicans said. But the Republicans nonetheless tried to impeach me. We had impeachment proceedings. And I think we're in the same situation now. I argued in front of the United States Supreme Court. I won a case 9-0 against a sex offender. And what happened in Texas happened in Texas, and I get that, but on December 1st, they're going to, they're taking the Mississippi case, and they're either going to overturn Roe v. Wade or restrict women's reproductive rights. And I think that's a personal choice. If you don't want to have an abortion, you should not have an abortion. But if you choose to, you should have that right. And I think who our next governor is going to matter, whether that's a Democrat or a Republican. And so we need to make sure we nominate someone from the Democratic Party who can actually win the general election.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Death with dignity is a very personal and a choice between family, and to God, and I have said publicly that I support death with dignity, and I would sign a bill as it comes to my desk. I also have said publicly that, that when we're talking about being able to make a constitutional amendment around the right to choose, that as a bill comes to my desk, I would sign that as well. I know, and I've had conversations with Speaker Jones about this very issue, where when people, and I've had conversations with people, even we saw for the process of the past year, where people said, well, I'm glad we're in Maryland because this is not a challenge. This is not an issue. Until we saw what happened in Texas. This is a moment where people realize that governors matter. And whether or not you live in Texas, what's happening right now with Governor Abbott, it is impacting me and my family. It's challenging all of us. And so I think in Maryland, if we believe in this, if we believe, as all of us do, in the core belief of choice, in the core belief of women's health care, then I think that if the legislature pushes forward and a bill comes to any of our desks, I think every single one of us would sign it. But it also goes back to the question of how exactly we would lead on it. And going back to the point about November, I think the important thing to remember is all of these issues and others are going to be on the ballot. These are going to be things that our next governor will have to think through. We'll have to work in partnership with the legislature, and why I've been so proud of the support that I have received from over a dozen legislative executive officials, from council people to delegates to senators, over half of the Baltimore City Council. Because we know in this moment, this is, to Attorney General's point, this is not just about how are we going to win a primary, but how are we poising ourselves to win in November? To energize the base but not alienate everyone else. And these issues like these, are things that our next governor is going to have to lead on, and I'm prepared to lead on them.
Mr. Perez, falls to you.
I think we all process these issues, the issue of death with dignity through a very personal lens, and we've all had those experiences. My mother struggled with dementia for 10 years, and bless you. Bless all of you. I recall it vividly, and that just, for me, it's a very personal decision, and I totally respect other people who don't want to do it, whose beliefs are as strong as mine in a different direction. But I do think that should be an individual choice. When I led the Civil Rights Division, one of the statutes we prosecuted was something called the FACE Act, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. We had a lot of cases involving folks who were not just obstructing reproductive health clinics, but were killing people. Dr. Slepian in Buffalo, 4 miles from the house where I grew up, was murdered. Dr. Tiller was murdered in Wichita. There are states right now, de facto, where a woman doesn't have a right to make that choice. The only choice that woman has, is to get in a car and travel elsewhere. And I think that's wrong. And, you know, and I've watched focus groups years ago where people said, well, you know, Democrats talk about abortion rights, and that's never going to change. Roe v. Wade is settled law. Boy, I wonder if they're still saying that, because I have little doubt about what's about to happen. And that is why we need the protections here in our Constitution in the state of Maryland, so that we will not have to worry about that issue. Women should not have to worry about that. Women should be able to make their own choice. I have seen firsthand the consequences of this in other states, and we shouldn't be there.
Well, we're nearing the finishing line here. You guys have been great. What I'd like to do is, in your closing statement, which I believe you have, what, 2 minutes? 2 or 3 minutes? You're going generous on them? I don't know. Macy's going to have something a little bit more exact on that. We'd love it if you tell us something about yourself that you haven't had a chance to talk about tonight. It can be a story. It can be a point of view on an issue that we've not addressed, but just tell us something new that we haven't heard tonight. And you each have 2 minutes to do so, but we'll be generous with the time card, apparently. We'll start with Mr. Gansler.
Okay.
Do you want me to give you 30 seconds?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
You know, if I've got 2 minutes plus some fudge room, I'll come up with something. You know, look, I think I'm the only one in the race with vision, experience, and a record in state government of getting things done. And I think as I go around the state, I talk to people, and they really want two things. They want someone with a record of accomplishment, a practical but progressive record of accomplishment, of getting things done. They don't think it's time to experiment. We're in the middle of a crisis. And they want someone who can win the general election, which we lost twice. And I think that's important for Baltimore. I love this city. I became a season ticket holder of the Orioles in 1989, before some of my opponents in the race were born. Worked here for 8 years as Attorney General and just spent an enormous amount of time here. I started, like I mentioned, the Trump City Youth Lacrosse League here 12 years ago. I was on the board of Year Up here. Been working on college track and on the board there in my private sector time in Suitland, Maryland, but we're working with the colleges around the state to get kids in. But Baltimore, in my view, if we don't have someone with a record of an experience and a vision, we will have another Republican governor and this city will suffocate. It's, you know, we've talked a lot tonight about the problems that we have in Baltimore and around the state. And you know, the reason why I would offer that I can lead is because I've done it before. Take coming out of COVID, as we rebuild the economy coming out of COVID and making sure we take advantage of the talents of every Marylander, wherever they come from, wherever they look like. We did that when I was the president of all the attorneys general in the country, and we had the national mortgage foreclosure crisis, and we got almost $2 billion into Maryland. We took on the big banks, and we kept hundreds of thousands of people in their homes and away from being evicted. And I worked with St. Ambrose and mortgage counselors here in Maryland to make sure that happened. What we need to do that is we rebuild our economy. Or when I prosecuted the Beltway snipers and looking forward into the criminal justice reform, making sure we keep our people safe in this state. So it's going to be an interesting next 7.5 months. You have a great panoply of candidates running on the Democratic side, some of whom are not here tonight. And they're all good people and they all have good visions, but we need to make sure we actually win the election.
To the young Mr. Moore.
He was born in 1989. Close.
First, just thank you, everybody. Thank you for this evening. Thank you for presenting not just this platform, but for the work you all continually do to present a place of unity and peace. As a Baltimorean, I can tell you how much this place means, and I'm grateful and I'm humbled to be here. As you asked your question, I honestly couldn't help but look out and look at my mom. Who's my rock? This is a woman who did everything right and didn't get her first job that gave her benefits until I was 14 years old. A woman who didn't get her first job that actually allowed her to work one job instead of multiple jobs, a job that gave her reliable hours until I was 14 years old. When we're having conversations about an equitable pay between men and women or an equitable pay between people of color and non, this is not an academic exercise to me. This is real, and this is personal. And it was through my mom that I decided to devote my entire life to public service. And that's exactly what I've done, whether it was leading soldiers in crisis, in combat in Afghanistan, leading a team of paratroopers with the 82nd Airborne Division, or whether it was coming back and starting a successful small business here in the city of Baltimore, in the state of Maryland, because when we thought the biggest challenge for students was just tuition, we were wrong. If you're not focusing on housing and transportation and food insecurity and childcare, you're going to completely miss the point. Or whether it was leading one of the largest nonprofits in this country. And when I think about the things that I'm hearing from people around the state, I'm not hearing from anybody around the state right now that I'm looking for someone who is looking for a promotion. I'm not hearing from anybody around the state that I'm looking for someone who has been doing this for 30 years. That what they're saying is, and what they're seeing in our campaign, the energy behind our campaign, is that while I've been a public servant my whole life, working on these issues. I just haven't been a politician. And the fact that we are receiving their support of over half of the Baltimore City Council, just received the support today from one of the senior senators from Montgomery County, received their support 2 weeks ago from the county executive of Anne Arundel County. That's not because I'm a nice guy. It's because they know I know how to get things done. And right now in this moment, we have a unique opportunity to do the thing that I learned in the military in my first days of basic training, where I learned a basic rule that I've come to live by, and that rule is this: leave nobody behind. And that's the state that we need to build.
Thank you. Mr. Perez?
I think you asked about, tell us something about yourself that you might not know. I'm having remarkable feelings of warmth here because my wife and I and our kids belong to St. Aloysius Gonzaga Parish in D.C., a parish identical to this. Unfortunately, the Jesuits shut it down about 10 years ago, but we won't get into that. But you know what? Where we worshiped was also a homeless shelter, the McKenna Center, named after Horace McKenna, who's being nominated for sainthood right now. And it was our opportunity to model for our kids. Every Wednesday night, we had a peace meal. And it was an opportunity to serve people experiencing homelessness, many of whom knew my wife because that was her day job. And every Wednesday was her night job. That's what it's about. Matthew 25 teaches us that when you are hungry, we give you food. When you are homeless, we give you shelter. When you are an immigrant among us, we welcome you. That's what my faith teaches me. Those teachings are not unique to the Catholic faith. It's remarkable how across faith traditions we have those similar moral imperatives that guide our work. And for me, that's guided my work throughout my career. Jobs and justice. You know, when my favorite museum is the MLK Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, because in that museum, among other things, there's a garbage truck. You know, Dr. King was working in the sanitation, organizing AFSCME workers in the sanitation industry when he died. I worked on the back of a trash truck because I was a kid when my dad died. You know, I did anything any summer to make money. So when I looked at that, you know, they were saying, you know, just because I pick up trash doesn't mean you can treat me like garbage. That's what this election is about. Dignity. The dignity of work. The dignity of a home over a roof over your head. The dignity of a good job that pays a decent wage. The capacity to go to the dentist and be able to get your teeth fixed so you don't suffer what DeMonte Driver suffered and what his family continues to suffer. And you know what? What I've always said to folks is if you want to figure out what someone's going to do in the future, a really good barometer is to look at what they've done in the past throughout their career. My entire career in public service, not a couple years here and a couple years there, but my entire career has been about jobs and justice, making sure we realize the promise of America. And I've worked in agencies as large as the U.S. Department of Labor, where our budget is bigger than the state of Maryland. Took over a department that was broken, and we were able to turn it around. So that's what I ask you to do. Take a look at all of us. It's a good field, they're good people. And ask yourself, who can multitask day one? Because we will need a multitasker in chief.
Thank you, sir.
So my wife, Amy, and I are raising our two daughters here in Baltimore City, and my daughters are 14 and 16. I'm just going to pause for a moment for any of you who have teenagers. And I'll say, after that, I'm currently teaching my 16-year-old to drive a car. I think about the world that my teenage daughters are growing up in and the world that my teenage daughters will inherit, and we have this window of opportunity. We have a window of opportunity coming out of this pandemic when there is an increasing recognition that the systems we have had in place in this country that we built in the 60s and the 30s for a very different world and a very different economy are not working. They're not working. And I think we all get it. All of us who live in Baltimore City get it. All of us who live in Maryland get it. All of us who live in this country get it. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And the next governor of this state has an opportunity and an obligation. The first thing our next governor is going to need to be able to do is create jobs. But not just create jobs. Create jobs that pay enough to raise a family, and create jobs that are accessible to everyone, regardless of zip code, regardless of family connections, regardless of whether or not I went to college, and regardless of whether or not I was incarcerated. The second thing our next governor is going to need to be able to do is challenge the status quo. That's obviously what I've been doing for decades. But we're going to need to be able to challenge the status quo that says things like we can't afford universal full-day pre-K, instead of recognizing that obviously universal full-day pre-K helps our kids live lives of security, but also lets us as parents go to work. We're going to need to be able to challenge the status quo that says incarceration is the only solution to public safety, instead of recognizing we keep spending more money on the criminal justice system, but we are no safer and we are no more equitable. As we've said multiple times tonight, Maryland is one of the richest states in the richest country in the world, and yet we spend almost our entire state budget on the symptoms of problems, not the causes of problems. We already have the economic resources and the tools and the capabilities to guarantee a career to everyone in Maryland who wants one. Everyone in Maryland who wants one. And when we create tens of thousands of jobs in Baltimore City and hundreds of thousands of jobs in this state and enable hundreds of thousands of Marylanders to move into a career that pays enough to raise a family, we will change the equation. Our next governor has the opportunity to solve a set of problems that haven't been solvable in decades. And that's what we're going to do. We can solve problems rather than just keep talking about them. Thanks again for this evening, and thanks again for this conversation.
So, and I too want to, Glendora and I want to thank the 125 people that attended tonight. In the days of Zoom and live streaming, you all get a special gold star for being willing to go out at night and come to this event. It says a lot about your commitment to this race, and so thank you for that, and thank you to, I did not mean to disparage the 350 people that are tuned in by live stream, but thank you to them as well, and we expect to be up to about 2,000 views by the weekend, so that's great. So I think you've gotten some really good exposure to who you are, and we really appreciate you coming to join us tonight at St. Ignatius, and we wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.